Good day, ladies and gentlemen. I just finished the first Law series, and this is probably my new favorite trilogy. I was already enthralled by the first novel, The Blade itself, and honestly the series only got better from there. That is why today I will give you a bit of a review, but also just a lot of reasons as to why you should pick up these amazing fantasy novels. But before we start with that, what is the series about? Well, honestly, that is pretty hard to say without spoiling the plot. See, Abercrombie keeps subverting your expectations as to where the story and the characters will go next. So if I tell you what book 2 is about, and especially if I tell you what book 3 is about, that would heavily spoil the first books. That being said, what is maybe more important even than the plot is the characters, because this trilogy is heavily character driven. In fact, it is so character driven that the first book doesn't really have a plot. So let me quickly go over the main tree so you know what to expect. Logan Ninefingers, also known as a Bloody Nine, is the most feared man on the northern side of the continent. He is known as a horrible monster who is capable of tearing through enemies faster than Angron can tear through the world leaders. A good thing, as about 90% of the people in the north would like to see him go back to the mud. Believing his squad to be dead, he eventually wanders to the south where he tries to be a better man. Filled with dark secrets, which you will learn throughout the series, one wonders if redemption is possible for one such as he. After all, one has to be realistic about these things. Senden Glokta was once the brightest hero of the Union, a charming warrior on a white horse, beloved by all and with a future brighter than the sun. At least that was until he was captured by the Gurkish and slowly pulled apart teeth by teeth. Nowadays he is a mangled cripple of a man filled with nothing but hate and self-pity. After spending so much time slowly being tortured to near death, he has joined the Inquisition, a place where his ghastly looks and torture experience can be put to proper use. Yet he can't help but wonder why he keeps putting people through the same pain he has been through. But well, sometimes certain means are needed to survive the end, and especially for a crippled Inquisitor. Giselle Don Luthar is a noble with money, good looks, a good career, and a massive talent for fencing. Yet he is also an arrogant, lazy brat who would rather get wasted every night than use his resources for something more productive. He gets sucked into a crazy ride though as he meets the wizard Bayaz. Throughout this story, many people will try to teach him how to be a better man, but will he learn from their advice, and will he learn these things in time? Well, you will have to read that for yourself. But in reality, this is just the top of the iceberg, as there are so many more amazing characters in this book. There's Pharaoh, a former slave on a quest for vengeance, who is so used to surviving you will have to see if she can actually learn to live again. Colin West is a commoner who, through extreme levels of determination, manages to climb the ranks of the Union. And he must have really pissed someone off in his past life because he keeps going from bad situations into worse ones. Furthermore, there are a bunch of crazy Northmen, some horrible politicians, alcoholic mercenaries, cannibal wizards, and well enough NPCs to fill up 2000 pages of grimdark awesomeness. The characters really are the major highlight of this saga. They are extremely well developed and fleshed out, which creates a very deep connection between the reader and the character. It may seem weird at first that the entire first book is dedicated to explaining and introducing these characters to you, however this is one of those cases in which the amount of build-up really pays off. This has to do with the phenomenal character arcs Abercrombie has worked out for all of them. The characters grow to all sorts of events, make all sorts of choices, and the consequences of these choices are masterfully shown throughout the rest of the story. Some of these are cool and satisfying, most are dark and bleak, but always they are very interesting. Rarely could I guess what would happen on the next page, and almost every time I thought I did, the book was eager to prove me wrong. Fantasy tropes are used but almost always subverted and twisted into something new, almost in a satirical manner. These arcs feel real, and while the story can sometimes be brutal as a result, there's a surprising amount of philosophical depth to them. It would be a spoiler to discuss it further, but I highly recommend you to think back after finishing the trilogy as to why everyone ended up the way they did. You might be surprised at the encouraging message that is hidden behind the nihilism. In a similar vein, I should also really stress that there's a point to almost everything in this series, but it might take a while to get there. I've heard people say that they didn't like certain characters or events, but that is very much a part of the experience. You will find that hated characters might become your favorite later on, and that your favorites may become your most despised. Outside of the message and the characters, another big highlight for me is the writing style. For starters, this series is pretty dark and nihilistic at times, yet Abercrombie always writes it in a fun way, filled with dark humor. This makes it so that while the story feels gritty and properly medieval, it rarely becomes hard to read or depressing. Awful scenes of torture and gruesome depictions of combat do have their time and place, but after showing them, Abercrombie quickly moves on to something else. And unlike, let's say, Saw, These books don't play up the shock factor as a gimmick. Abercrombie just adds enough to make the story feel real and to convey that indeed the medieval times weren't all too pleasant. Similarly, for the combat scenes, he writes them in a cinematic and epic way with a proper amount of chaos and bloodshed, but the books never linger on them. In other words, they have their place, but it never descends into bolter or torture porn. For the warmer readers amongst you, think Arendemski Bowden with a splash of Rat's humor, but if I'm being honest, I'd say it's better than both. Furthermore, I should mention that the book frequently switches from perspective between the main cast as well as a number of side characters, and this is great because of two reasons. First of all, because of how deep of a connection the reader has to these characters, it is interesting to see their real thoughts and experience on certain events. It is therefore not uncommon for these books to show the reaction of multiple characters to the same events. This also goes a long way to explain why certain characters might make decisions that seem weird or stupid at first glance. The other reason is that the plot of the books is very cleverly tied together, so because we learn perspectives from all over the continent, we can see certain things coming already. We can learn what set in motion events that happen to a different character, and this can create a lot of tension as well, because you as the reader often know things the characters don't, akin to seeing a monster walking up to the victim in a horror movie. Then the final point I want to talk about is the minimalistic world building, because it is actually very unfantasy-like. I often find with fantasy books you get a whole bunch of world building, complex magic systems, boatloads of races and cultures, dozens of nations and environments, and in the First Law you get none of that. Instead, the setting is extremely focused and only explores the things really necessary for the story. Every piece of world building plays a major role in the actual plot, and commonly it is defined by characters that play a crucial role in it. Being used to Warhammer novels, I quite like the change of pace as it allows the books to move at a rapid pace without a need for much exposition load. But I can imagine some people being a bit disappointed at the lack of these aforementioned fantasy elements. And well, that's basically all I want to say about these books. Instead, I just advise you to drop what you're doing and start reading them. If you have read them, then please let me know your thoughts in the comments. I gotta get back to reading Best Served Cold. If you like this video, please consider subscribing and click ringing the bell to appease the Great Horned Rat. For more lore content, please check my main channel and leave any book recommendations in the comments down below. I gotta get back to reading the next book.